It was supposed to be a paradise. Henry Flagler, the oil magnate, poured his fortune into a towering beacon of luxury, the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. But beneath its opulent facade lies a darker tale. This was no mere resort. It became a monument to loss, where love was destroyed and lives crumbled. Flagler's first wife died after a stay there. His second wife spiraled into madness, ultimately abandoned in an asylum, and his third wife watched him die in a nearby mansion, her own fate a haunting shadow. The Breakers Hotel wasn't just a symbol of excess, it was the tomb of Flagler's dreams. But perhaps the most haunting truth was yet to come. The hotel itself seemed to carry a curse, burning down not once, but twice. Could the building itself be trying to escape the torment that birthed it? The dream that demanded everything. Henry Flagler's vision for Palm Beach was clear. He would create an empire for the rich, where beauty and luxury would blend into eternity. The year was 1893. America was changing. The Gilded Age had arrived with all its excess and possibility. Men like Flagler understood something fundamental about wealth. It wasn't enough to have it. You had to show it. You had to build monuments that would outlast your own mortality. Flagler had already conquered one world. As John D. Rockefeller's partner in Standard Oil, he had helped build the most powerful corporation America had ever seen. He had amassed a fortune that most men could barely comprehend. $30 million, perhaps more. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. He was 63 years old when he first turned his attention to Florida. Most men his age were thinking about retirement, about quiet dignity in their final years. Not Henry Flagler. He saw something in the swampland and scrub brush of Florida's east coast that no one else could see. A paradise waiting to be born. The idea consumed him. He would build a railway down the entire eastern coast of Florida. He would transform mosquito-infested wilderness into a destination for the wealthiest people in America. And at the heart of it all, he would build a hotel unlike anything the world had ever seen. Palm Beach was nothing then. A barrier island with a few scattered homes, wild palms and sea grapes, endless beaches where the Atlantic rolled in with patient inevitability. But Flagler could see past what was. He saw what could be. The Breakers would be his crown jewel. A massive wooden structure painted bright yellow with wide verandas and airy rooms designed to capture the ocean breeze. It would cost him $400,000 to build, a staggering sum in those days. Enough to feed a small city for a year. But money had never been the question for Henry Flagler. The question was always about legacy. What would remain when he was gone? What would people remember? He threw himself into the project with frightening intensity. Every detail mattered. The placement of windows, the width of hallways, the quality of linens. He hired the best architects, the finest craftsmen. Nothing could be left to chance. His associates warned him. Florida was a gamble. The climate was brutal. Hurricanes could destroy everything in a single night. Disease ran rampant in the summer months. The wealthy elite preferred Newport and the Hamptons. Why would they travel to the edge of civilization? Flagler dismissed their concerns. He had built an empire on taking calculated risks. This would be no different. But there was something else driving him, something deeper than business acumen or the desire for profit. He was running from grief. His first wife, Mary, had died just 4 years earlier. The loss had shattered something inside him. Building the Breakers was a way to outrun the pain, to create something beautiful enough to erase the memory of what he had lost. The construction moved forward with relentless speed. Workers labored in the punishing Florida heat. Lumber arrived by the trainload. The skeleton of the building rose against the blue sky. Month by month, the dream took shape. Flagler visited the construction site constantly. He would stand on the beach and watch the building grow. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine the sounds that would soon fill those halls. Laughter, music, the gentle clink of champagne glasses, the rustle of silk gowns. He could see it all so clearly, the future he was building, the paradise he would create. What he couldn't see was the price that paradise would demand. The first wife's fate. In the very building Flagler constructed, his first wife, Mary, would perish, her life snuffed out by the luxury that should have promised her joy. The truth about Mary Harkness Flagler is more complicated than the legend suggests. She didn't die in the breakers itself, but the hotel and her death are forever intertwined in the mythology of Palm Beach. The confusion is understandable. The timeline is cruel. Mary died in 1881, more than a decade before the breakers was built. But she had accompanied Flagler on his first trip to Florida in 1878. They had traveled to Jacksonville seeking relief from her declining health. She suffered from chronic illness, the specifics lost to history, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps something else entirely. The warm Florida climate did nothing to save her. She grew weaker, more frail. Flagler watched helplessly as the woman he loved slipped away from him. They had been married for 33 years. They had raised 3 children together. She had been there from the beginning, before the oil fortune, before the power and influence. When she died, Flagler was 47 years old, still vital, still ambitious, but hollowed out by grief. He remarried quickly. Too quickly, some said. Just 2 years after Mary's death, he married Ida Alice Showards, a woman 20 years his junior. She was beautiful, vivacious, and seemed to bring light back into his darkened world. But by the time the breakers opened its doors in 1894, that second marriage was already fracturing. Ida had begun showing signs of mental instability. The grand hotel that was meant to be a celebration of Flagler's success became instead a gilded cage where his second wife's madness slowly revealed itself. The confusion between Mary and Ida, between which wife died and which wife went mad, speaks to something deeper. The breakers became a repository for all of Flagler's personal tragedies. The building absorbed the grief, the loss, the slow dissolution of his private happiness. Guests who stayed at the hotel in those early years noticed something strange. Despite all the luxury and careful attention to detail, there was a melancholy that hung in the air. The servants whispered about it. The way certain rooms felt cold, even in the Florida heat. The way shadows seemed to linger in corners. Flagler himself spent little time actually staying at the breakers. He preferred his private estate, Whitehall, just down the beach. The hotel was for guests, for visitors, for the wealthy elite he courted so carefully. But he couldn't escape its presence. Every morning he would walk along the beach and see it rising against the sky. Every night its lights would glow in the distance. The building had become a monument to something he couldn't quite articulate. Not just wealth or success, but the emptiness that comes when you achieve everything you thought you wanted and realize it isn't enough. Mary's ghost didn't haunt the breakers in any literal sense. But her absence did, the life they might have lived together in Florida's sunshine, the happiness that had been stolen by illness and time. The The hotel stood as a reminder of everything Flagler had built and everything he had lost. And that was only the beginning of the tragedies that would unfold within those walls. The splendor of a false paradise. Flagler's hotel became a beacon of wealth, but beneath the grandeur, a more sinister force lurked, one that would slowly consume him and those closest to him. The breakers opened to immediate acclaim. The first guests arrived in January of 1894, stepping off Flagler's railway cars directly onto the grounds of paradise. They gasped at the sight. The sprawling yellow building seemed to glow in the tropical sunlight. 6 stories tall, stretching 540 feet along the beach. 450 rooms, though only a portion were finished in time for that first season. The numbers tell part of the story. 1,200 feet of covered verandas where guests could take the sea air. Dining rooms that could seat hundreds. Ballrooms with crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. Elevators that whisked guests to their floors, a modern marvel that many had never experienced before. But numbers can't capture the atmosphere Flagler had created. The sense of arrival, of having reached a place separate from the ordinary world. Palm Beach, in those days, was truly remote. You couldn't simply drive there. You took Flagler's railroad, or you didn't go at all. That isolation was part of the appeal. The wealthy elite could escape to a world where they were surrounded only by their own kind. The daily rate was $5 per person. Expensive, but not outrageous. Flagler understood that filling the hotel mattered more than maximizing profit on each room. He wanted the breakers to be the place everyone talked about, the destination that defined social success. And it worked. The first season was a triumph. Vanderbilts and Astors walked those halls. Morgan and Carnegie sent their representatives. The guest book read like a directory of American power. These were the people who owned railroads and steel mills, who controlled newspapers and banks, who shaped the very future of the nation. They came to see and be seen, to parade their wealth in elaborate costumes for evening dinners, to gossip and scheme and arrange marriages between their children. The breakers became a stage, and every guest was performing a role in the grand theater of the Gilded Age. But behind the performance, something was crumbling. Ida Alice Flagler, Henry's second wife, was unraveling. The signs had been there before, but in the hothouse atmosphere of Palm Beach, they became impossible to ignore. She claimed to be receiving messages from spirits. She spoke of grand conspiracies. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic. Flagler tried to maintain appearances. He kept his wife away from the hotel as much as possible. He made excuses for her absences. But servants talked. Guests noticed. The whispers began. Here was a man who had built a paradise, but he couldn't find peace in his own marriage. He had created a monument to leisure and beauty, but he was trapped in a prison of social expectation and personal misery. The irony was not lost on those who knew him well. The building itself seemed to absorb these tensions. Some guests reported strange occurrences, doors that wouldn't stay closed, the sound of weeping in empty corridors, shadows that moved against the light. Were these the products of overactive imaginations, fed by too much champagne and too little sleep, or was something else at work? The rational explanation is simple enough. The Breakers was a new building settling on sandy soil. Wood creaked and shifted. Ocean winds caused drafts. The plumbing made strange noises. Every old hotel accumulates stories of ghosts and hauntings. It's almost a requirement, but the stories persisted. and they took on a darker quality as Flagler's personal tragedies mounted, as if the building itself was reflecting the pain of its creator. The first season ended in April. Guests departed back to their northern estates. Flagler closed the hotel for the summer months, when the heat and humidity made Palm Beach unbearable for those unaccustomed to tropical climates. Workers covered the furniture, shuttered the windows, left the building to drowse in the thick summer air, and Flagler was left to contemplate what he had built. A dream realized that somehow felt hollow, a paradise that couldn't protect him from his own demons. The next winter season would bring more guests, more acclaim, more profit, but the false paradise was already beginning to crack. The second wife's madness. The woman Flagler chose to replace his first wife would descend into madness within the very walls of the Breakers. Ida Alice Showards had seemed like a safe choice. She was a nurse, practical and capable. She had worked for Mary during her final illness. She understood Flagler's world, his needs, his habits. The courtship was brief. The marriage in 1883 raised eyebrows but not outright scandal. Wealthy widowers remarried. That was simply how things worked. For a few years, it seemed to work. Ida adapted to her new role as Mrs. Henry Flagler. She presided over social functions. She dressed the part. She said the right things at dinner parties. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Something was breaking. The first clear signs appeared in the early 1890s. Ida began making wild claims. She insisted she was in communication with the dead, including Mary, Flagler's first wife. She claimed to have supernatural powers. She accused Flagler of plots against her, of trying to control her mind. At first, Flagler tried to manage the situation privately. He hired doctors. They prescribed rest and quiet. They suggested European cures, water treatments, changes of scenery. Nothing helped. Ida's delusions intensified. She became convinced she was married to the Tsar of Russia. This wasn't a passing fancy, but a fixed belief that dominated her thinking. She would speak of her imperial responsibilities. She ordered servants to address her by invented titles. She wrote letters to foreign governments that had to be intercepted before they could be sent. For Flagler, this was a nightmare beyond anything he could have imagined. His business empire depended on reputation, on the appearance of control and stability. And here was his wife, spiraling into public madness. The Breakers became one of the stages where this tragedy played out. During the winter social season of 1897, Ida's behavior reached a crisis point. She appeared at dinner wearing bizarre combinations of jewelry and clothing. She made pronouncements that left guests bewildered and uncomfortable. She wandered the halls at night, knocking on doors, speaking in voices that weren't her own. The staff didn't know how to respond. Should they restrain her? Alert Mr. Flagler? Try to reason with her? They did their best to keep her episodes contained, to prevent guests from witnessing the worst of it. But secrets don't keep in a hotel filled with America's most connected families. The whispers became gossip. The gossip became scandal. Flagler had to act. In 1897, he had Ida committed to a private sanatorium in Pleasantville, New York. The doctors diagnosed her with what they called dementia. Today we might recognize symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But mental illness was poorly understood then. Treatment options were limited and often cruel. Flagler visited her occasionally in those early months. He paid for the best care available, but his visits grew less frequent. The woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone who accused him of terrible things every time he appeared. The legal complications were staggering. Divorce was nearly impossible in New York at that time, especially for someone of Flagler's prominence. You needed to prove adultery or extreme cruelty. Neither applied in any conventional sense. Flagler was trapped in a marriage to a woman who would never recover, who would spend the rest of her life institutionalized. He found a solution, though it required moving the goalposts. Flagler convinced the Florida legislature to pass a new law in 1901 that allowed divorce on grounds of incurable insanity. The law was written specifically for his situation. Money and influence opened doors that remained closed to ordinary people. In 1901, Flagler divorced Ida Alice Shords. She remained in the sanatorium where she would live for another 29 years, dying in 1930 at the age of 83. She outlived Flagler by 17 years, outlived him while trapped in a mind that had long since lost touch with reality. The human cost is almost impossible to calculate. A woman's entire life reduced to a medical file, a marriage that became a prison for both parties, and the breakers standing witness to it all. Some of the hotel staff swore they could feel Ida's presence in certain rooms. The suite she had occupied during her worst episodes remained unlucky. Guests who stayed there reported disturbed sleep, a feeling of being watched, an oppressive sadness that no amount of ocean breeze could dispel. Were these genuine hauntings, or simply the power of suggestion working on minds primed to believe in ghosts? The building itself offers no answers, but the stories accumulated. They became part of the breaker's identity, a luxury hotel with shadows in its past. Flagler moved on, as men of his wealth and power could always move on. But the damage had been done. The paradise he built had failed to protect the woman he married, had perhaps even contributed to her decline, with its relentless social pressure and public scrutiny. The dream was revealing its true cost, from love to insanity. A love built on grandeur would crumble, leaving only despair in its wake, as Flagler's second wife was institutionalized in an asylum. The mechanics of Ida's institutionalization reveal much about power and gender in the Gilded Age. A wealthy man could have his wife committed with alarming ease. 2 doctors' signatures, a legal petition, and a woman lost her freedom. Ida Alice Shords Flagler never had a chance to tell her own story. Everything we know about her mental decline comes filtered through the perspectives of others: doctors who examined her, servants who witnessed her episodes, newspaper accounts that traded in sensation and scandal. Even Flagler's own testimony, delivered during divorce proceedings, must be viewed with skepticism. He had every reason to paint her condition in the darkest possible terms. What did Ida herself experience? We can only guess. The confusion as her grip on reality loosened, the terror of thoughts she couldn't control, the isolation as people she trusted turned into adversaries. Did she understand what was happening to her? Did she fight against the committal or welcome it as relief from the chaos in her mind? The sanatorium where she spent her final decades was called Dr. Carlos McDonald's Private Hospital. It was located in Choate House, a large estate in Pleasantville, New York. By the standards of the time, it was considered progressive. Patients received individual attention. The grounds were pleasant. There were no chains or straitjackets unless absolutely necessary. But it was still a prison. Ida couldn't leave, couldn't make decisions about her own care, couldn't participate in the world beyond those walls. She was 46 years old when she was first committed. She had potentially decades of life ahead of her. All of it would be spent in confinement. Flagler paid the bills, approximately $10,000 per year for her care, a substantial sum, but barely a fraction of his wealth. He did his legal duty as her husband, but emotionally, he had already moved on. The divorce in 1901 was a formality in some ways. Ida was already lost to him, but it served an important purpose. It freed him to marry again. And less than 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Flagler married Mary Lily Keenan, a woman 37 years his junior. The speed was shocking even by the standards of the time. Flagler was 71 years old. Mary Lily was 34. She came from a good family in North Carolina. She was educated, cultured, and most importantly, mentally stable. Flagler wanted a companion for his final years, someone who could play the role of society wife without the complications that had destroyed his marriage to Ida. But the shadow of that second marriage haunted him. How could it not? Somewhere in New York, his former wife sat in a sanatorium, possibly thinking she was the Tsarina of Russia, possibly lost in depths of confusion we can barely imagine. And Flagler was dancing at balls in Palm Beach with his new young bride. The contrast reveals something essential about Flagler's character. He was a man who moved forward relentlessly. When a problem couldn't be solved, he simply stepped around it, built a new railroad, changed the law, remarried. The same drive that made him successful in business made him capable of breathtaking emotional compartmentalization in his personal life. Did he feel guilt about Ida's fate? We have no record of such feelings. Perhaps he convinced himself he had done everything possible. Perhaps he believed that mental illness was simply bad luck, a tragedy beyond anyone's control. Or perhaps he didn't think about it at all, having trained himself to focus only on what he could change and build. The Breakers stood witness to this chapter of abandonment. The rooms where Ida had walked in her confusion now hosted new guests who knew nothing of the tragedy. The ballrooms where she had made her final public appearances now rang with laughter and music. The building absorbed the story and kept its secrets. And in that sanatorium in New York, Ida Alice Showards Flagler lived on, year after year, season after season. While the Breakers entertained the wealthy elite, she sat in a comfortable room, trapped in a mind that had betrayed her. Some say she remained convinced until her death that she was royalty, that the sanatorium was actually a palace where she awaited her return to power. Perhaps that delusion was a mercy. Perhaps it was better than understanding the truth of her situation. She died in 1930, 17 years after Flagler himself had passed. She was 83 years old. She had spent more than 3 decades institutionalized. And when she died, there was no grand funeral, no public mourning. She was buried quietly, her passing noted in a few brief newspaper items that emphasized her connection to Flagler more than her own existence. The cruelty of that erasure speaks volumes about how society treated women, especially women who had the misfortune to lose their minds. Ida's life was reduced to a footnote in the story of a great man, a cautionary tale, a problem that had been solved and forgotten. But the Breakers remembered. In its own way, the building held on to the story of the woman who had wandered its halls in madness. And perhaps that's why the ghost stories persisted. Not because of actual supernatural phenomena, but because the human mind seeks justice in narrative. We want Ida to be remembered, even if only as a haunting presence, even if only as a shadow in the corner of a grand ballroom. The curse of the Breakers, as the hotel burned to the ground in 1903, was it simply a tragedy, or was it the beginning of a curse that haunted Flagler's life and his legacy? The fire started in the early morning hours of March 18, 1903. The guests had long since departed for the season. The breakers sat nearly empty, occupied only by a skeleton staff preparing the building for its summer closure. Accounts differ on the exact cause. Some say it began in the laundry room. Others point to the kitchen where hot irons had been left unattended. The truth is probably simpler and more mundane. The building was made almost entirely of wood. It had gas lighting and primitive electrical systems. Fires in hotels were common in that era, deadly common. What isn't in dispute is how fast the flames spread. Wood that had been drying in the Florida sun for 9 years burned like kindling. The fire raced through the structure with terrifying speed. Staff members barely had time to evacuate. One worker reportedly made 3 trips back into the burning building to rescue whatever he could carry. Within hours, the breakers was gone, completely destroyed. Only the foundation remained, and even that was damaged beyond repair. Flagler's $400,000 investment reduced to ash and charred timber. 9 years of success erased in a single morning. The financial loss was substantial but not catastrophic for a man of Flagler's wealth. The real blow was symbolic. He had built a monument to permanence, to the idea that wealth could create beauty that would last forever. And it had burned to nothing. Flagler was 73 years old when he received the news, old enough to feel the weight of mortality, old enough to wonder if he had the energy to rebuild. His associates assumed he would simply collect the insurance money and move on. Palm Beach had other hotels. The Royal Poinciana was still operating successfully, but Flagler wasn't built to give up. The fire offended him on a fundamental level. It represented chaos intruding on order, failure where he demanded success. Within days of the fire, he announced his intention to rebuild. Not just rebuild, but to create something even grander. This decision reveals something crucial about Flagler's psychology. He couldn't let the fire have the last word, couldn't allow his enemies, and a man of his power always had enemies, to see him defeated. The new breakers would prove that Henry Flagler was stronger than disaster, but the timing was ominous. The fire happened just 2 years after his divorce from Ida, just as he was settling into his 3rd marriage. Some saw the fire as cosmic justice, a sign that Flagler's personal betrayals had called down punishment from the universe. The superstitious whispered about curses. They pointed to the pattern of tragedy that surrounded the building. Mary dead before it was finished, Ida driven mad within its walls, and now the building itself consumed by flame. Maybe the breakers was never meant to stand. Maybe some dreams are too tainted to survive. Flagler would have dismissed such talk as nonsense. He was a practical man, a businessman. He understood structural fire risks and insurance policies, not supernatural vengeance. But did some part of him wonder? Late at night, in his mansion down the beach, did he think about the coincidences piling up? Did he question whether he had built his paradise on cursed ground? The rational explanations are perfectly adequate. Wooden buildings burn, marriages fail, people go mad. Tragedy is part of the human experience, and building hotels doesn't grant immunity from loss. Yet the stories of a curse persisted. They became part of Palm Beach lore. Visitors to the empty lot where the breakers had stood reported strange feelings. A coldness in the air despite the tropical heat, a sense of watching eyes, the smell of smoke when there was no fire. Most likely these were manifestations of grief and shock working on the human imagination. The community had lost its crown jewel. That kind of collective trauma creates its own mythology. But what if something more was at work? What if the intense emotions that had saturated that building, the love and loss and madness and ambition, had somehow imprinted on the place itself? Not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that certain locations carry the weight of their history. The fire marked a turning point. Before it, the breakers represented triumph. After it, the hotel carried an air of tragedy that no amount of luxury could quite dispel. The curse, if it existed, wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. It was the story people told themselves about ambition and its costs. Flagler began planning the new hotel immediately. It would be larger, grander, more fireproof. It would prove that he could not be defeated. But he was rebuilding on the ashes of more than just a wooden building. He was trying to resurrect a dream that had already revealed its dark underside. The question wasn't whether he could rebuild the breakers. The question was whether the new building would escape the shadow of the old. The Phoenix of Palm Beach. In 1904, the breakers rose from the ashes, more magnificent than ever, but with a newfound darkness embedded in its walls. Flagler hired the best architects money could buy. He wanted a building that would never burn again. That meant steel and concrete instead of wood. Fireproof materials throughout. Modern safety systems that would make disaster impossible. The new breakers would be designed in the Italian Renaissance style, massive and imposing, with a central courtyard and twin towers that would dominate the Palm Beach skyline. The architecture firm of Carrere and Hastings received the commission. They had already designed the New York Public Library and would go on to create some of America's most iconic buildings. The construction timeline was aggressive. Flagler wanted the hotel operational for the next winter season. That gave them barely a year to design and build what would be one of the largest resort hotels in the world. The construction site became a hive of activity. Hundreds of workers labored around the clock. Materials arrived by ship and railway. Steel girders rose against the sky. The cost exceeded any reasonable projection. Final estimates put the total at $2.5 million, 6 times what the original building had cost. But Flagler didn't hesitate. This wasn't about profit anymore. It was about legacy, about proving something to himself and the world. The new Breakers opened its doors in January of 1904. Guests arrived to find a palace unlike anything they had seen in America. The main building stretched 400 feet along the beach, 500 guest rooms, elaborate public spaces decorated with imported marble and hand-painted ceilings, private bathrooms in every room, a luxury that even the finest hotels rarely offered. The dining room could seat 1,200 guests at once. The ballroom featured crystal chandeliers that weighed thousands of pounds each. The grounds included tennis courts, swimming pools, and manicured gardens that employed 30 full-time gardeners to maintain. The numbers tell a story of excess bordering on madness. Flagler spent $60,000 on furniture for the public spaces alone, $75,000 on carpets and draperies. The bed linens cost enough to buy a substantial house. Every detail was perfect because Flagler would accept nothing less. Critics called it vulgar, accused Flagler of building a monument to his own ego. They weren't entirely wrong. The new Breakers was a statement. It said that Henry Flagler could not be defeated, not by fire, not by scandal, not by the whispers about his treatment of his second wife. But something had changed. The original Breakers had possessed a lightness, a sense of joy and possibility. The new building was different, heavier, more serious. It felt less like a vacation resort and more like a fortress, as if Flagler was daring the universe to try again. guests noticed the difference. The hotel was undeniably magnificent, but it lacked warmth. The vast public spaces felt impersonal. The marble floors echoed with footsteps. The Renaissance architecture, while impressive, created an atmosphere of intimidation rather than welcome. And the ghost stories returned almost immediately. Despite the new construction and modern materials, staff members reported strange occurrences. Elevator cars that stopped on floors where no one had pressed a button. Doors in unoccupied suites that were found standing open. The sound of music coming from the ballroom when no events were scheduled. Were these genuine paranormal events, or simply the power of suggestion, combined with the natural settling and functioning of a large building? The rational explanation remains more plausible. Hotels are complex machines with thousands of moving parts. Strange noises and unexplained events are inevitable. But the stories accumulated. They took on a life of their own. Guests began requesting certain rooms and avoiding others. The suite where Ida Flagler had stayed, or at least its rough equivalent in the new building, developed a reputation. Guests who stayed there reported nightmares, a feeling of profound sadness. Some checked out early rather than spend another night. Flagler himself maintained his residence at Whitehall, his private mansion. He rarely stayed overnight at the breakers. Perhaps he found the constant bustle exhausting. Perhaps the building held too many painful associations. Or perhaps he simply preferred the quiet of his own home. His third wife, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, performed her duties as hostess with practiced grace. She presided over social events. She ensured that important guests received proper attention. But those who knew her well noticed a certain sadness in her eyes. She was playing a role in a play she had joined midstream, surrounded by the ghosts of her husband's previous marriages. The new breakers succeeded in business terms. It filled every winter season. It generated substantial revenue. It became the social center of Palm Beach, just as Flagler had intended. But it never quite captured the magic of the original building. Perhaps that magic had been an illusion all along. The original breakers had been built on hope and ambition untested by tragedy. The new building rose from ashes and heartbreak. It carried the weight of everything that had gone wrong. Flagler was 74 years old when the new hotel opened. He had maybe a decade of life left, though he couldn't know that. He had rebuilt his dream, but at what cost? The question haunted the halls of the breakers, even as orchestras played and champagne flowed. The phoenix had risen, but phoenixes burn before they're reborn, and something essential is always lost in the flames. Flagler's final days. As Flagler grew older, his dreams of empire seemed less solid. In the shadow of his third wife, his own mortality became undeniable. The years after 1904 brought a strange mixture of triumph and decline for Henry Flagler. His railroad had reached Key West in 1912, completing what many had called an impossible dream. The Overseas Railroad connected the Florida Keys to the mainland through a series of bridges and causeways that represented the pinnacle of engineering ambition. 156 miles of track, 42 bridges, including the famous 7-mile bridge. The project cost $50 million and claimed the lives of hundreds of workers. Hurricanes destroyed sections that had to be rebuilt multiple times. But Flagler persevered with the same stubborn determination that had built the breakers. He was 82 years old when the first train arrived in Key West. Too old to fully enjoy the victory, his health was failing. The vigor that had driven him through 8 decades was finally ebbing away. Mary Lily Keenan Flagler watched her husband's decline with a mixture of devotion and dread. She had married him when he was 71 and she was 34. The age gap had been shocking, but Mary Lily had known what she was getting into. Flagler offered security, status, and wealth beyond imagination. She offered companionship and care for a man entering his final years. Their marriage was apparently happy, at least by outward appearances. They had no children together, which was probably for the best, given Flagler's age, but they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. Mary Lily brought a warmth to Whitehall that had been missing during the Ida years. But she must have known how the story would end. She was married to a man in his 70s and 80s. Widowhood was inevitable, and when it came, she would be left to navigate a complicated legacy. Flagler spent his final years consolidating his empire, making sure his various businesses and properties would be properly managed after his death. He established trusts, revised his will multiple times, tried to ensure that his life's work would outlive him. The breakers continued to operate successfully. Each winter season brought new waves of wealthy guests. But Flagler visited less and less frequently. The walk from Whitehall became too difficult. The crowds and noise were exhausting. He preferred to sit on his veranda and look out at the ocean he had worked so hard to tame. On January 19, 1913, Flagler suffered a fall down the Fiji marble stairs at Whitehall. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Perhaps he tripped, perhaps he fainted, perhaps age had simply robbed him of his balance. He fractured his hip. At 83 years old, such an injury was often fatal. For months he lingered. Doctors provided what care they could, but medicine in 1913 had few solutions for broken bones in elderly patients. Flagler remained bedridden at Whitehall. Mary Lily stayed by his side. Visitors came and went. Business associates sought his guidance on decisions that would outlast him. He died on May 20th, 1913. Kidney failure, the official cause. But really, he died of being 83 years old, with a broken body that could no longer sustain the force of his will. The funeral was held at Whitehall. Then his body was transported north to St. Augustine, where he had first fallen in love with Florida decades earlier. He was buried in a mausoleum he had built for his first wife, Mary Harkness. Flagler. The symbolism was poignant. His third wife stood at the funeral, knowing that even in death, Flagler's heart belonged to his first marriage. Mary Lily inherited a massive fortune, approximately $100 million by some estimates, though the exact amount is impossible to verify. She was 46 years old and one of the wealthiest women in America. The world was supposed to open up for her, freedom and possibility after years of caring for an aging husband. But Mary Lily's story after Flagler's death became its own tragedy. She remarried in 1916 to Robert Worth Bingham, a judge from Kentucky. The marriage was troubled from the start. Bingham seemed more interested in Mary Lily's money than in Mary Lily herself. Less than a year after the wedding, Mary Lily was dead. The official cause was heart failure, but rumors swirled about drug addiction, about possible poisoning, about Bingham's suspicious eagerness to claim her fortune. An investigation was launched, but no charges were ever filed. The truth died with her. She was buried next to her family in North Carolina, not next to Flagler in Florida. Another wife, another tragic end. The pattern held, and the breakers stood witness to it all. Flagler had built it, watched it burn, built it again, and then left it behind as his legacy to a world that would remember the buildings more than the man. The hotel hosted parties and celebrations, even as its creator's body lay dying in a mansion down the beach. Life continued. The wealthy needed their playground. Individual tragedies didn't matter in the grand scheme of luxury and excess. The building had outlived its builder. But the shadows remained, the ghosts of 3 wives and a man who had sacrificed everything human for monuments of stone and steel. The end of an empire. As Flagler breathed his last in 1913, the breakers still stood, a gleaming monument to the man who created it. But was it worth the cost? Henry Morrison, Flagler left behind an estate valued at approximately $100 million. The exact figure varied depending on how you calculated the worth of his railroad, his hotels, his land holdings throughout Florida. But by any measure, he died one of the richest men in America. His Standard Oil fortune formed the foundation. The partnership with John D. Rockefeller had made both men titans of industry, but Flagler's Florida investments had multiplied that wealth exponentially. The land he bought for pennies per acre sold for thousands. The railroad that everyone said would fail became the economic engine of an entire state. The breakers alone was worth millions. Not just the physical building, but the brand, the reputation, the social cachet attached to staying there. Flagler had successfully created the idea that Palm Beach was where important people went to escape winter. That idea generated value that persisted long after his death. But what had it cost him? 3 marriages, 3 wives, 3 different flavors of tragedy. Mary dead from illness, her final years spent watching her husband's restless ambition. Ida locked away in madness, abandoned by the man who had promised to cherish her. Mary Lily widowed and then dead herself within 4 years of Flagler's passing, possibly murdered for the fortune he left her. He had spent decades building, rarely slowing down, never truly resting. The work had consumed him, defined him, given his life meaning, but it had also hollowed him out, left him unable to connect with the people closest to him on any genuine emotional level. His children's relationships with him were strained at best. His son Harry had died in 1908, just 5 years before Flagler himself. His daughters maintained dutiful contact, but seemed to view their father more as an institution than as a man. He had given them wealth and status. Whether he had given them love is less clear. The empire he built transformed Florida from a backwater into a destination. The population of Palm Beach grew from a handful of families to thousands. Hotels, shops, services, entire communities sprang up along his railroad. Wealth flowed in. Tourism became an industry. Other developers followed where Flagler led. But that transformation came at a cost, too. The natural Florida that had first attracted him was paved over, built up, commercialized. The wilderness gave way to golf courses and tennis courts. The wildlife retreated before the advance of luxury. Paradise was tamed, and in the taming, lost something essential. The workers who built Flagler's empire rarely shared in its rewards. The men who laid railroad track through swamps and hurricanes earned subsistence wages. Many died from disease or accidents. Their names are forgotten, while Flagler's is memorialized on buildings and streets throughout Florida. The breakers itself employed hundreds of workers, maids and cooks and gardeners and maintenance staff. They made the luxury possible for guests who rarely acknowledge their existence. The vast gap between the wealthy guests and the working staff reflected the broader inequality of the Gilded Age. Flagler wasn't particularly worse than his contemporaries in this regard. He paid market wages. He didn't tolerate obvious cruelty. But he also didn't question the system that allowed him to accumulate $100 million, while the people who cleaned his hotel rooms struggled to feed their families. The moral calculus of Flagler's life resists easy judgment. He built beautiful things. He created economic opportunities. He had a vision and the determination to realize it. These are genuine achievements. But he also weaponized the legal system to divorce a mentally ill wife. He worked men to death building his railroad. He prioritized monuments over people, legacy over love. These failures are equally genuine. The Breakers stands as a testament to both sides of that equation. It's beautiful and it's built on suffering. It represents human achievement and human callousness. It's a palace and a tomb. When Flagler died, the hotel continued operating as if nothing had changed. New management, same luxury. The guests who arrived that winter season barely noted his passing. A few newspaper obituaries, a memorial service, and then business as usual. Perhaps that's the truest measure of his legacy. He had built something that didn't need him anymore. The Breakers had become bigger than its creator. It had taken on a life of its own, separate from the man whose vision had called it into existence. But the ghosts remained. The stories of tragedy and loss. The whispers of curses and hauntings. These couldn't be erased by management changes or renovations. They were woven into the fabric of the building itself. Flagler had wanted to build something eternal, something that would outlast him and prove his significance. He succeeded, but eternity is a long time to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The Breakers reborn. The Breakers survived, rebuilt from the ashes, but the stories of the women it consumed lived on, haunting the halls of the new hotel. The 1904 rebuilding wasn't the end of the Breakers' evolution. In 1925, disaster struck again. Fire once more. This time, the blaze was smaller, more contained, but it still caused significant damage and forced yet another reconstruction. The pattern seemed almost too symbolic to be coincidence. 1903, 1925, 22 years apart. As if the building itself periodically needed to shed its skin and be reborn. The 1925 rebuild transformed the Breakers into the structure that still stands today. The architects Schulze and Weaver created an even grander Italian Renaissance palazzo, 7 stories, 572 rooms, twin Belvedere towers that became the defining silhouette of Palm Beach. The cost exceeded $6 million, equivalent to roughly $100 million in modern currency. Every material was the finest available. Imported marble from Italy, hand-painted frescoes on the ceilings, furnishings that would have been at home in European palaces. The Flagler family still controlled the property, though Henry himself had been dead for 12 years by then. His heirs understood that the Breakers was more than a hotel. It was a monument to their patriarch. It had to be maintained and enhanced no matter the cost. The new building opened in December of 1926. The timing was significant. America was in the midst of the Roaring Twenties. Wealth had reached new heights. The stock market seemed invincible. Prohibition had made drinking illicit and therefore fashionable. Palm Beach became a playground for the decade's characteristic excess. The Breakers fit perfectly into this new era. It was big enough, luxurious enough, exclusive enough to satisfy the appetites of a generation that seemed determined to party away the memory of World War I. But beneath the champagne and Charleston dancing, the old stories persisted. New staff members heard about the hotel's tragic history, the 3 wives, the fires, the alleged curse. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others swore they had experienced strange phenomena themselves. A housekeeper reported seeing a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing in a 4th-floor window. When she went to investigate, the room was empty and locked. A night clerk heard piano music coming from the ballroom at 3 in the morning. He went to investigate and found the room dark and silent. Were these genuine hauntings or the products of suggestion and fatigue? The building certainly provided enough atmosphere to fuel imagination. Long corridors, ornate decorations, the sound of wind and waves. Old hotels collect ghost stories the way they collect dust. It's almost unavoidable. But some of the phenomena were harder to dismiss. Guests with no knowledge of the hotel's history reported feeling unwelcome in certain rooms. A pervasive sadness that no amount of luxury could dispel. One woman reportedly checked out in the middle of the night, insisting that someone was crying in her bathroom, though no physical presence could be found. The rational explanations remain more plausible than supernatural ones. Buildings make noises, plumbing gurgles, wind creates drafts. Tired minds see patterns where none exist. The human brain is wired to find faces and meaning even in random stimuli. But the persistence of the stories suggests something beyond simple misperception. Perhaps certain places do carry psychic weight, not ghosts in any literal sense, but accumulated emotion, trauma soaked into walls, grief embedded in foundations. The breakers had been the site of so much feeling, love and ambition and madness and loss. Thousands of guests had passed through, each leaving their own residue of emotion, layer upon layer, year after year. The building absorbed it all, held it, reflected it back at those sensitive enough to perceive it. Not as apparitions or spectral figures, but as atmosphere, as mood, as a certain quality of light in hallways that couldn't quite be explained. Mary Harkness Flagler, dead before the original building was completed. Ida Alice Flagler, driven mad within its walls. Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, widowed and then dead under suspicious circumstances. Did some part of them remain? Did their stories demand to be remembered even as new generations of guests made new memories? The hotel management would never officially acknowledge anything supernatural. That would be bad for business. The breakers sold luxury and comfort, not ghost tours. But the staff knew. They traded stories in break rooms, compared experiences, noted which rooms seemed to have more problems than others. And sometimes, late at night, when the hotel was quiet, you could almost feel it. The weight of history. The presence of all those who had walked these halls before, not threatening, not even particularly frightening, just there, permanent, undeniable. The breakers had survived fires and rebuilds and changes in ownership. It had outlasted its creator and all his wives. It stood as one of the grand hotels of America, a landmark of luxury and excess. But it also stood as a monument to tragedy, to the cost of ambition, to lives destroyed in the pursuit of paradise. And those stories, like the building itself, refused to disappear. Ghosts of Palm Beach today. The Breakers stands as a testament to luxury, but do the ghosts of Flagler's wives still haunt its halls? The modern Breakers operates as a 5-star resort. It hosts weddings and conferences. Families vacation there. Business executives negotiate deals over breakfast. The building has been meticulously maintained and updated. Climate control, Wi-Fi, all the amenities modern travelers expect. but walk through the older sections late at night and you can still feel the weight of the past. The original 1926 construction remains largely intact in certain areas. High ceilings, marble floors, ornate architectural details that speak to an era of different priorities. Staff members still report unusual occurrences. These stories are typically shared quietly, not broadcast to guests. A housekeeper finds fresh water in a vase that should be empty. A maintenance worker hears footsteps on stairs he just confirmed were empty. Elevator operators notice the car occasionally stops on floors where no one pushed a button. Are these evidence of genuine paranormal activity? The skeptical explanation remains more convincing. The Breakers is a massive building with complex systems. Plumbing creates strange sounds. Electrical issues cause equipment to malfunction. Memory plays tricks. People see what they expect to see. But some incidents resist easy explanation. A guest in 2008 reported waking to find her jewelry rearranged on the dresser, forming a pattern she swore she hadn't created. A couple in 2015 complained that their room felt perpetually cold despite the thermostat reading 72 degrees. A child in 2020 asked his parents who the sad lady in the old dress was, though no such person appeared in any photographs. The hotel has never officially embraced its ghost stories. There are no marketed paranormal tours, no ghost hunting events. The Breakers sells elegance and luxury, not supernatural thrills. But the stories circulate anyway, passed from guest to guest, staff member to staff member. Some paranormal investigators have attempted to study the building. They report elevated electromagnetic readings in certain areas, electronic voice phenomena that might be words or might be random noise, temperature fluctuations that could indicate spiritual presence or could indicate faulty heating systems. The methodology of ghost hunting remains highly controversial. Even those who believe in the paranormal acknowledge that most alleged evidence has rational explanations. The human capacity for self-deception is vast. We want to believe in ghosts because they suggest death isn't final, that love and tragedy persist beyond the grave. But whether the ghosts are real or imagined, their effect is genuine. The stories change how people experience the Breakers. A creaking floorboard becomes footsteps. A shadow becomes a figure. A feeling of melancholy becomes a spiritual presence. Perhaps that's the real haunting, not literal spirits, but the power of narrative to shape perception. We know the tragic history. We know about the 3 wives and their fates. That knowledge colors everything we experience in the building. Mary Harkness Flagler died in 1881, long before the Breakers existed. But the myth of her connection to the hotel persists. Ida Alice Flagler was institutionalized in New York, hundreds of miles away. But she walked these halls during her descent into madness, and that's what people remember. Mary Lily Keenan Flagler died in 1917, 4 years after her husband, probably poisoned by her second husband. But she lived at Whitehall, not the Breakers. The details get fuzzy, the timeline compresses. All 3 women merge in the popular imagination into a collective tragedy centered on this one building. The truth becomes less important than the story, and the story says that the Breakers is haunted by the cost of one man's ambition. Maybe that's true, even if no actual ghosts exist. The building is haunted by history, by the reminder that all this beauty was built on suffering, that the luxury we enjoy as guests was created by human sacrifice. That ambition devours those who get too close to it. Walk through the Breakers today and you see beautiful things, restored frescoes, polished marble, ocean views that take your breath away. But if you look closely, if you let yourself feel the full weight of the place, you also see the shadows, the places where light doesn't quite reach, the corners that feel cold no matter the season. The ghosts of Palm Beach aren't necessarily supernatural, they're historical. They're the persistence of memory in stone and steel. They're the refusal of tragedy to be forgotten, even when covered over with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. And perhaps they serve a purpose. They remind us that paradise always has a cost, that monuments to human achievement are also monuments to human failing, that every beautiful thing we create casts a shadow proportional to its light. The Breakers stands today as one of the finest hotels in America. Guests pay premium prices for the privilege of staying there, and they should. The service is impeccable. The setting is magnificent. The experience is genuinely extraordinary. But late at night, when the parties are over and the crowds have dispersed, the building remembers. It holds the stories of everyone who ever walked through its doors. The joyful and the tragic, the celebrated and the forgotten. And if you listen carefully in the quiet moments, you might hear echoes, not voices exactly, not footsteps or crying or any obvious haunting, just echoes, the persistence of the past, the ghosts we carry with us, whether we believe in them or not. The legacy of the broken dream. Flagler's vision, a monument to wealth and power, now stands as a haunting reminder of the price of ambition, love, family, and ultimately life itself. 113 years after Henry Flagler's death, the Breakers remains. It has survived fires, hurricanes, economic depressions, world wars, and countless changes in ownership and management. The building has outlasted everyone who knew Flagler personally, outlasted his wives, his children, his business partners. It stands as precisely what he intended: a monument, a landmark, a symbol of human ambition and achievement. Architectural historians praise its design. Travel magazines list it among America's finest hotels. It generates millions of dollars in revenue every year. But it also stands as something Flagler never intended: a cautionary tale, a reminder that success measured in buildings and bank accounts may come at a cost, measured in human happiness and destroyed lives. The three wives represent three different kinds of tragedy. Mary, dead too young from illness that wealth couldn't cure. Ida, locked away in madness that status couldn't prevent. Mary Lily, free at last with Flagler's fortune, only to die under suspicious circumstances. Three women whose lives were consumed by proximity to power and ambition. Would their lives have been better if they had never met Henry Flagler? Impossible to know. Mary seemed to have a genuinely loving marriage for most of her years with him. Ida's mental illness might have emerged regardless of who she married. Mary Lily chose her fate, marrying a man 4 decades older than herself with clear understanding of what that meant. But the pattern is undeniable. Wealth and power offered no protection, perhaps even made things worse. The public scrutiny, the pressure to perform, the isolation that comes from existing in rarefied social circles. These women lived gilded lives, but the gilding couldn't prevent suffering. Flagler himself seems to have understood this on some level, at least toward the end. His final years were marked by a certain weariness. The drive that had sustained him through decades of building and scheming and accumulating began to ebb. He had everything a man could want in material terms. And it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. The Breaker stands as his answer to mortality. He couldn't live forever, but his buildings could. They would carry his name and his legacy forward through generations who would never know him personally. In that sense, he succeeded. People still say Flagler's name when they talk about Florida's development. The hotel ensures he won't be forgotten. But what is he remembered for? Building hotels and railroads, certainly. Transforming a state. Creating infrastructure that millions of people still use. These are genuine achievements worthy of recognition, but also for ruthlessness, for divorcing a mentally ill wife by manipulating the legal system, for prioritizing monuments over people, for the suspicious circumstances around his third wife's death, for the human cost of his ambition. The legacy is mixed, complicated, resistant to simple judgments of good or evil. Like most historical figures who achieved great things, Flagler contained multitudes, visionary and tyrant, builder and destroyer, husband and abandoner. The Breakers forces us to reckon with that complexity. Every beautiful detail in the hotel represents human labor, human creativity, human skill, but it also represents exploitation, environmental destruction, and social inequality. The same facts can be framed as either achievement or atrocity, depending on perspective. Perhaps the ET's most honest assessment is that both are true simultaneously. The Breakers is magnificent and terrible, a wonder and a warning. It represents the best and worst of American capitalism during the Gilded Age. Walking through the hotel today, you can choose what to see, the beauty or the cost, the achievement or the sacrifice. Most guests choose beauty. They're on vacation. They want to enjoy the luxury they've paid for, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the shadows remain visible if you look for them, in the contrast between the opulent guest rooms and the plain staff areas, in the history plaques that celebrate Flagler without mentioning his wives, in the persistent ghost stories that refuse to be rationalized away. The building holds all of it, the triumph and the tragedy, the love and the loss, the ambition and its consequences. That's what makes the Breakers more than just a hotel. It's a repository of human experience in all its messy, contradictory complexity. Henry Flagler dreamed of paradise. He poured his fortune and his life's energy into creating it, and he succeeded in building something extraordinary. But paradise always comes at a price. The question each of us must answer is whether we're willing to pay it. The Breakers asks that question silently. It stands on its beach, beautiful and haunted, magnificent and tragic. A monument to dreams and a tomb for those dreams. A palace built on ambition and loss. The waves roll in as they have for millennia. The palm trees sway in the tropical breeze. The sun sets in spectacular colors over the Atlantic. And the Breakers endures, holding its secrets, remembering its ghosts, standing witness to the price we pay for the things we build. Flagler's vision demanded everything. He gave it. So did the women who loved him. So did the workers who built his dream. The cost was calculated in lives damaged and destroyed, in opportunities lost, in human potential sacrificed to the gods of progress and profit. Was it worth it? The building can't answer that question. It can only stand and remember. The rest is up to us, to decide what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, what kind of monuments we want to leave behind. The Breakers will outlast all of us. Long after we're forgotten, it will still be there, still beautiful, still haunted, still asking the questions that matter most. What does it cost to build paradise? And who pays the price?